Farmland tenure and reform efforts vary across country. And in this module, we're going to talk about three of those: China, Russia, and Brazil. And I'm going to set this up in a little bit here. But land reform and land tenure is one of the large factors that affect agriculture and economic growth. And we're going to provide a little bit of flavor for that in this module. China, Russia, and Brazil all have had land reform efforts going on, and that has both led to increases in agricultural productivity as well as some lingering problems. So that's what we're going to talk about in this module, and it specifically relates to our last module in the terms of property rights, and in particular related to land. Here are two facts about farmland that are obvious, but do have pretty large implications as far as property rights and land reform. The first is you can't move land from one country to another. It's a fixed, immovable asset, and that in some sense makes it very unique. You can think of a lot of assets that you can move from one country to another. Take, for example, even a factory. You think of that as being a fairly immovable asset, but you can take the machinery out of a factory and move it from one country to the next much more easily. And in fact, it's impossible to move land from one country to the next. It is stuck within the country and it will not move. So that has a couple of implications. The productivity of that land will be very much related to the business environment of that country. And if that business environment becomes better, we'll expect to see land productivity increase, and the converse. If land productivity or the business environment decreases or gets worse, we will expect land productivity to go down. One of the laws in this country, or some states have laws that prohibit farmland ownership by foreign firms or foreign individuals. I always find that somewhat interesting, because why do you care if a foreign born individual owns the land? What are they going to do with it? They can't take it back to their own country, so why do we get concerned about foreign ownership? So point number one, you can't take land from one country to the next. And number two, land has a long, hopefully forever life. Hopefully land's going to be productive for as long as we can see into the future. And that has another implication as far as related to its specific location. If you look at purchasing land, once it's up and running, its current returns are a very small portion of its total price. And just coming back to it, if you have an asset that's only a 3-year life, you got to recover that whole asset value in its first 3 years. Land has an infinite horizon, or forever horizon. So when you begin to look at land, you got to think about it in terms of that length of time. And so any political uncertainty, even into the foreseeable future, will have a large impact on what happens on that piece of land, because you're making an investment on that land that will have payouts forever and will become capitalized into that farmland. Given that background, we're going to cover 4 topics in this module, and we have 7 readings to go along with those. These readings are really short, so don't get worried about having to spend too much time reading them. Most of them are journal articles, or Wall Street Journal articles, or The Economist articles, and I just want to give you a feel for the thinking or the public comments that's going on these topics. We're going to look at land reform or land reform efforts in China, number 1 topic. Russia, number 2 topic, and you can see 2 readings associated with each of those. Then we're going to talk about number 3, land tenure, specifically as it relates to development and security. So that will be topic 3, and what we're going to see there is that land tenure has a large impact on agricultural productivity and also on development. The fourth topic will be land reform in Brazil, and we have 3 readings there. And again, all of these are pretty short. There are either articles from The Economist or from Time magazine. So, fairly short articles, nothing too heavy lifting about them. First, let's turn to China. And again, Wall Street Journal article, reading 1, covers the Chinese situation. And let's just provide a little background here. We had in China private land ownership up through the early years of the Mao regime. So through the mid 1900s, China had private ownership of farmland. Mao collectivized the farms and did that in the mid 1900s, and it led to disastrous results. One of the things that we learned from both the Soviet Union experience and the Chinese experience is that collectivized farms under a communist regime produced disastrous agricultural results. So we had that system, and now China is moving back to property rights. And what they're doing to move back to property rights is 30-year leases. What China is moving towards is not outright ownership of farmland, but 30-year leasing rights. And 30 years is a long time, and you would expect that in 30 years, or in the beginning of those 30 years, individuals would be willing to make large investments in those properties. But in my opinion, it's going to be interesting to see what happens as those 30-year leases get closer to the end. Let's say now we're sitting here 20 years from now, 10-year lease left, or 25 years lease, 5 years left. Now are those individuals going to be willing to make the same investment that they're willing to make right now with 30 years? Again, coming back to our first point, land, or second point, second basic fact, land is a long-term, hopefully forever asset. So the investments that you make have large payouts over time. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in China as those leases near their expiration. Note also from the article that documentation of those leases have been a concern. Clear deeds and clear titles on farmland, and for that matter any other property, is a plus. And we'll go back to module 8-1 where we mentioned that one of the functions of government is to make trade and free trade amongst individuals happen. One of those things that governments need to do is provide a clear, transparent, and unchanging to a large extent system for setting up or maintaining property rights through recorded deeds, through other things. And particularly in agriculture, you need those deeds, those land definitions or the boundary definitions to be a matter of public record and of security. Third point here, note that in China there's been concerns about confiscation for land use for other activities. You see that also here in this country when you talk about eminent domain, and that is guaranteed to evoke a lot of emotion. And in general, if you violate property rights in any sort of way, you decrease the incentive to take care of that property. So anytime we want to move land into quote-unquote more productive uses, which would be implied by that reading in China, that doesn't have a good impact on land use. Final point here, trust is an important part of land tenure. If you believe a system is going to exist, and again, land is an infinite asset, trust and a belief that this system is going to be stable forever is an important part of an agricultural system. Now let's turn to Russia, land reform in Russia, and this relates to reading 2, and this is actually a case study from Cornell. So take a look at it, and it deals again with farm restructuring in Russia. Again, we have an example here. The Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, collectivized farms. They put all private ownership of land into a big unit, and again, just like China, it led to very poor results. And it's sort of interesting. Some reports are that during the Soviet era, much of the production from farmland was actually from small individual plots, and the collectivized farms did very poorly. Again, one of the major lessons that we can learn from the Soviet Union and China is that collectivized farms under communist or a government system produce very poor results. 1990s, we land farm began again. Um, Soviet Union fell. Communist government fell. Now it has a, I guess you would call it a totalitarian system, but nevertheless, um, uh, collectivism didn't work and land reform began. When the former Soviet Union or Russia instituted land reform, what they had to do was take these large collectivized farms and break them up. And the way they did that was to introduce land sharing. And this is covered on page 4. Individuals of either the collective or private individuals, and this could include former owners of the farmland that were owners of it before it was collectivized. Each individual received equal conditional shares of the collective farms. So they took these collective farms and divided up into equal shares. Landowners, and this is the second point there, had the right to withdraw at any time. So if you owned this share of this collective farm, you could either, at the current time point, choose to remain in that collective farm and take proceeds from that collective farm, or you could get your land out. You could do that now, or you could do that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. You always have the right to take land and withdraw it. Once you've decided that you want to withdraw the farmland, then the boundaries would be drawn. So at this current time point, this land reform gave every individual an option, which they could introduce or do sometime in the future, and the if a person introduced or chose to exercise that option, then the land would have to be withdrawn and the boundaries drawn. As you can think about this, what that would do would be cause those collective farms or that entity as a whole not to have a stable land base. Because if at any time in the future any ground can be withdrawn from that. Now let's take an example. Let's say this collective farm has all this farm and they want to do business with another agribusiness entity. They want to lease that farmland to this other agribusiness entity, and the other agribusiness entity wants it for a long time period. The collective farm, or the former collective farm, can't really guarantee the land base because at any point in time the individual members of that land base can withdraw it. So that causes a instability in the land base, and that is problematic from a standpoint of doing business and improving land. What is a result of this land reform was three things, three types of organizations, and it's hard to know how much of each one of these exists. First, you had a continuation of the collective farms. However, note the instability there. Each of those collective farms have individual owners that can exercise a right at any time to withdraw farmland. Individual farm owners who do have somewhat of a fixed land and presumably a stable land base. And finally, private firms with outside capital. And if you're a private firm with outside capital, one of the first things you may want to do is, or likely do, is get a lease from these large collective farms. Private farms or firms, they have outside capital, they know how to farm. Let's get a large land price from these collective farms. But the collective farms can rent a land to them, but there is no, again, stable land base that the collective farms can rent to them because at any time the individuals can withdraw from that collective farm. This land reform introduced the following problems. First is that businesses that want to lease land had to do so from different land groups, and there wasn't a stable land base. That led to the second problem. Because there is no stable land base, agribusinesses could not purchase land and use it for collateral, for loans, and which then led to the third point is that purchasers do not know the result of the final purchase. Think about it this way. If an agribusiness wanted to buy land from a collectivized farm, they didn't know what they were buying because at any point in time the individual landowner that owned a share of that could exercise a right to get land out of there. Fourth final point is that there's poor land registration, which is probably more of a problem that's outside of these, but there doesn't appear to be a system where we can record land ownership that everyone trusts. And again, what you're going to see here with farmland is that stable system where we can trust the land ownership is a very important aspect of the system. What this two cases, China and Russia, do point to three things that are needed for a stable agriculture. And this is covered in Readings 3, Land Tenure Security and Agricultural Productivity. And that article, and it's again a short one, makes the case that land tenure security has a very large influence on agricultural productivity. And again, the reasons for that is the infinite life of land and the need for investment, and you need to have a belief that you're going to own that land for a long period of time. This particular article, Reading 3, is particularly talking about the African case, and often in Africa we don't have secure titles, but for stable agriculture we need to have the confidence that the land will not be confiscated or we won't lose the land in the future. We have clear title to it, and there's a land registry or some place where we can record the deed that everybody believes that this is a place where we record it or has trust in it, and that way we have very little or there's a way to determine how disputes are determined on farmland. Clear title, obviously, we've hit that a number of times, and trust that you'll own land is a key for productivity, agricultural productivity. In both the China and the Russia case, we had the case of land reform. And here is a point. The distribution of who owns farmland often is a concern. And basically, who owns farmland has wealth. If you own farmland, you're generally you own a piece of land, you have some wealth. And often others that don't own that farmland believe that you shouldn't own it. And in the China and the Russia case, there was a good case for that. Collective farms owned by the state hadn't performed well, and let's get it to private ownership. But often there's also a concern that there are large landowners who own a large portion of the land, and should they own that? And in those cases, often the concerns about states owning farmland and large ownership of farmland lead to land reform efforts. And again, this is covered a bit in Reading 4, which again is from the OAS, Organization of American States, and it covers the distribution of farmland and some of the concerns that it raises in Latin and South America. Again, what we often see is that the ownership of land is very concentrated. It's owned in a very few hands. We see a lot of emphasis on land reform. And again, we've seen it in the former Soviet Union, China, Africa. We often have concerns about land reform or who owns land and moving land that is moved, that is owned by the current individuals to another group of individuals. And land reform may be needed from a justice standpoint. So maybe in certain cases, and I'm not making a judgment on that, the current owners of the farmland shouldn't own it, or it's unclear, or whatever. But the land reform effort in and of itself dilutes trust in the current land ownership structure. Few believe that land reform is possible. It reduces the incentive to improve the land currently, because at some point in time, if you're an owner of farmland and looking to improve it, you may lose that farmland in the future. One of the, again, coming back to the basic point about farmland, you can't move it. Um, the individuals that own farmland are at the whim of the state. If the state decides that a new ownership structure is desired and go about changing that, um, that that leads to instability and reduced incentive to make land investments. Which finally brings us back to Brazil. And Brazil, as we've said a number of times, has made tremendous gains in agricultural productivity in the past several decades. Again, we have another reading 5 here, The Miracle. This chronicles the Brazilian resurgence or growth in agriculture. It's an article from The Economist, and it actually, in some senses, celebrates the growth in Brazilian agriculture. One note about much of the new growth in agriculture in Brazil is that it's large scale. Farms are large by any measure. They're much larger than farms in the United States and often encompass very large areas. Well, that large scale, large size, often means that very few people own land. If you have one farm that's, for example, 100,000 acres, or about the size of Champaign County, maybe a little half the size of Champaign County, it raises concerns about land ownership. Do too few people own the land? Which have brought up land reform issues in Brazil. And here I'm going to point to reading 6, which is the agrarian reform, another Economist article, just so we get the same publication talking about agrarian reform in Brazil. But there they note that 1% of owners control 45% of the farmland in Brazil, and that there is this landless rural workers movement that is talking about land reform. Now, I'm not particularly taking a side on whether the landless rural workers movement or those individuals are correct or have a case to be made, or whether or not Brazilian agriculture is too concentrated. I'm just bringing up the fact that one of the backdrops of what's happening in Brazil is this undercurrent of agrarian reform and land reform. And that has brought about even violence, and that point is made in Reading 7, where we have a Time News article about just a land reform murder that happened. And again, just large-scale agriculture, Roman Catholic Church, and do take a look at Reading 7. Roman Catholic Church, nuns and priests agitating for land reform. Again, my point here is not to take sides in that issue, but to note if you're an agribusiness doing business in Brazil, that may be one of the concerns that you should have from the standpoint, one, is it just? two, even if it is just, you have to worry about somewhat about the public relations items that might occur. And three, is there a risk of land reform in the future, and what will that do to commercial agriculture in Brazil? To summarize this module, land tenure and stability is a key for agriculture to survive and prosper. And there are land reform efforts that occur frequently, actually, over much of the globe. Those land reform efforts are a double-edged sword. It does add uncertainty for commercial agriculture, even though it may or may not add justice to this quote-unquote system. But it does add uncertainty for commercial agriculture that relies on a stable land base with clear property titles.